Ethan's mornings carried a sense of quiet anticipation. At 5 a.m. sharp, his alarm would break the silence of his modest apartment, a space that bore the marks of his steady yet demanding life. The smell of coffee mingled with the faint scent of smoke that seemed embedded in his clothes. No matter how many times he washed them, he lived in a small town where the fire station stood as both a beacon of safety and a second home. As a firefighter, Ethan embodied courage and duty, but his demeanor was far from boastful. His colleagues often joked that he was the heart of their crew, always the first to crack a joke in tense moments, the one who quietly checked on everyone after a tough call. Beneath the ash and grit of his job, Ethan's warmth shone through. He was the guy who stayed late to clean the trucks, not because he had to, but because it felt like an unspoken ritual of respect for the work they did. Ethan was the kind of man who found beauty in simplicity. On his days off, he'd take long walks through the woods, the crunch of leaves beneath his boots offering a rhythm that soothed his mind. His shelves were filled with books on survival, philosophy, and a few dog-eared paperbacks about adventure. Perhaps a subtle reflection of the balance he sought between the chaos of his work and the peace he craved. His routine was one of discipline, shaped by the unpredictable demands of his profession. Early workouts, followed by long shifts that could flip from quiet to life-threatening in a heartbeat. Ethan thrived on the camaraderie of the station, where laughter and shared burdens forged bonds thicker than blood. But there were nights when the quiet settled too deeply and the weight of memories, the people he couldn't save, pressed hard against his chest. Ethan's compassion extended beyond the station. He volunteered at a local shelter, fixing broken faucets or simply sitting with those who needed an ear. His presence was steady, like the kind of anchor people clung to during storms. Yet, he often wondered who he could lean on when his own strength faltered. To the outside world, Ethan was a hero, a brave man who ran toward danger when others ran away. But life, as it does, had a way of sneaking up on even the strongest. Beneath the steady rhythm of his days, a storm was quietly brewing, ready to challenge everything he thought he knew about himself. The shift had started like any other, a routine check of the fire engines, light-hearted banter in the kitchen over black coffee, and the hum of the radio filling the air with the quiet promise of another uneventful day. But Ethan knew better than to trust the calm. Firefighting had taught him that life had a way of flipping the script when you least expected it. The call came mid-afternoon, a house fire, children trapped inside. The team snapped into action, their practice efficiency a dance between urgency and control. Ethan was the first through the door, heat licking at his gear, the roar of flames a deafening symphony around him. He found the kids, 2 boys huddled in a corner, their faces streaked with soot, and carried them out to safety. But not everyone made it that day. A mother, desperate to save her children, had perished before they arrived. Ethan held her sons as they sobbed, his heart breaking with theirs. For the first time in his career, he felt the fire leave scars he couldn't see. It didn't end there. The faces of that family haunted him in quiet moments, creeping in when he was alone in his apartment or walking the woods he once found so peaceful. His sleep became restless, his dreams vivid with scenes he couldn't unsee. Ethan began to withdraw. The laughter that once filled the fire station seemed louder now, almost grating, as if it mocked the heaviness in his chest. He told himself it was just part of the job, occupational hazard. But this was different. His body felt heavy, his mind sluggish. He skipped workouts, made excuses to avoid his friends, and left books unfinished on his shelf. Even at the station, the place that had always felt like home, he started pulling back, taking fewer shifts and avoiding calls he knew would shake him. It wasn't just the memories. It was the weight of expectations. Everyone saw him as a hero, the dependable one. How could he admit that he felt like he was drowning? Depression crept into his life like smoke under a closed door, slow, suffocating, and nearly invisible until it consumed him. The fire in Ethan's spirit, the one that had fueled his drive to protect others, now felt like a flickering ember. He was losing himself, and he wasn't sure how to fight back. The strong, steady man everyone admired was crumbling inside, and no one knew. Not yet. One evening, as Ethan sat staring at the blank walls of his apartment, the silence pressed down on him like the weight of his gear during a fire. His hands trembled as he held his phone, scrolling aimlessly through messages he didn't have the energy to answer. Then a name popped up, a name he hadn't seen in years. It was Cal, an old friend from high school who had taken a different path. They hadn't spoken in ages, but something about that message. "Hey, I heard you've been going through a rough time. Want to talk?" Hit like a lifeline tossed into the raging waters of Ethan's mind. Cal wasn't just anyone. He was a firefighter once, too, until his own battles with mental health led him to a new calling: group therapy for first responders. Ethan didn't want to go at first. The idea of opening up, of laying bare the parts of himself he barely understood, felt like facing a fire without his gear. But Cal's persistence was gentle, like a steady hand on his shoulder, and it planted a seed Ethan didn't know was there. A week later, he found himself sitting in a circle with strangers who somehow felt familiar. The room was unassuming, the kind of place you wouldn't notice from the outside. Yet, inside, it buzzed with a raw honesty that felt almost holy. Ethan listened as others spoke. Paramedics, police officers, firefighters, each voice weaving a tapestry of shared struggle and unspoken resilience. He didn't speak at first. Just hearing others put words to feelings he'd buried was like breathing fresh air after being trapped in smoke. Slowly, though, he began to share, his words hesitant at first, then pouring out in waves. Cal introduced Ethan to practices that became his anchors. Meditation, simple at first, helped him find pockets of calm amidst the chaos in his mind. "It's not about fixing anything," Cal had said. "It's about learning to sit with the flames without being consumed." The group embraced mindfulness, breathing exercises and journaling, creating a toolkit Ethan hadn't realized he needed. But it wasn't just the techniques, it was a connection. The realization that he wasn't alone in his fight, that others bore the same scars, became the foundation of his healing. The group's mantra echoed in his mind: "You don't have to fight the fire alone." For the first time in months, Ethan began to feel a flicker of something he hadn't in a long time: hope. One chilly autumn morning, Ethan's phone buzzed with a message from Cal. It wasn't the usual check-in or reminder about the next group session. This time, it was an invitation. "There's a retreat for first responders next weekend. It's intense, but I think it's what you need. Let me know if you're ready." Ethan stared at the message for hours. A retreat? The word alone sounded foreign, almost indulgent. His mind raced with doubts. What would his team think if they knew? What if he failed to make progress? The idea of spending an entire weekend facing his emotions head-on felt as daunting as running into a burning building blindfolded. That night, as he sat alone in his apartment, he glanced at a photo on his wall. It was from his first year as a firefighter, a younger, brighter-eyed version of himself standing proudly next to the engine. His uniform was crisp, his smile wide. That man had dreams, confidence, a fire that burned brighter than any blaze he'd ever fought. Something shifted in Ethan. He realized that the man in that photo wouldn't let fear dictate his choices. So, with trembling fingers, he typed back a simple reply: "I'm in." The retreat wasn't what he expected. It wasn't all meditation and serene walks in the woods. It was raw and challenging, stripping away every layer of avoidance he'd built up. Days began early with group discussions that forced him to confront the pain he'd buried. There were solo exercises designed to reignite purpose, and long, silent hikes where he wrestled with memories that still cut deep. One evening, around a roaring campfire, participants were asked to share the moment they first felt broken. Ethan hesitated as the group waited, the crackling fire casting shadows on their expectant faces. Finally, he spoke about the fire, the family, and the guilt that had taken root in his chest ever since. His voice cracked, and for the first time in years, he cried. What surprised him most wasn't the vulnerability. It was the response. No one looked away. No one judged. Instead, the group leaned in, their support wrapping around him like the warmth of the fire. For the first time, Ethan felt a glimmer of what healing could look like. When the weekend ended, Ethan wasn't magically fixed. The pain hadn't vanished, and the road ahead still felt steep. But he'd crossed the threshold, stepping into a new world where he wasn't just surviving. He was learning to live again, back in his daily life. Ethan quickly learned that the retreat was only the beginning. Healing wasn't a straight path. It was a winding trail with pitfalls and obstacles that tested his resolve. His first challenge came at work. He had started opening up to his colleagues, sharing bits of his struggle during casual conversations, but not everyone responded with understanding. A few brushed it off with, "We've all got stress, man. You just deal with it." Others avoided the topic entirely, their discomfort evident. It stung. But Ethan reminded himself of something Cal had said, "Not everyone will understand, and that's okay. Your healing isn't for them. It's for you." Then there was the nightmare that returned uninvited one restless night. Flames roared, screams echoed, and his feet felt rooted to the ground. He woke up in a cold sweat, heart racing. Instead of spiraling into panic like before, Ethan reached for his journal, scribbling down every detail he could remember. Cal had taught him to see these moments as signals, opportunities to face, not flee. His greatest test came during a house fire a few weeks later. The smoke was dense, the heat suffocating. As he led his team into the blaze, a familiar wave of fear rose, threatening to drown him. For a split second he froze, but then he heard Cal's voice in his mind. "Breathe. Anchor yourself. Trust your training." He inhaled deeply, steadying his nerves, and pressed on. When they emerged with the family safe, Ethan realized he hadn't just survived the fire. He had faced his demons and won. Through these trials, Ethan found unexpected allies. Mia, a paramedic who had been part of the retreat, became a constant source of encouragement. Over coffee breaks and late-night texts, they exchanged struggles and small victories. Their camaraderie a reminder that healing didn't have to be solitary. There was also Jackson, an older firefighter who noticed Ethan's growing interest in mindfulness. One evening at the station, Jackson handed him a worn-out book on stoicism, saying, "This helped me when I lost my way. Maybe it'll help you too." Ethan devoured its lessons, finding strength in its simple truths. Control what you can, accept what you can't, and move forward with purpose. Each test sharpened Ethan's resilience. Each ally reminded him that support could come from the unlikeliest places. And while the road ahead still loomed uncertain, Ethan was beginning to trust himself, to believe that he had what it took to keep walking, no matter how heavy the load. Ethan stood in front of the mirror one morning, studying his reflection. The man staring back at him looked weathered but determined. He wasn't the same person who had stumbled into Cal's group months ago, desperate and hollow. But he wasn't fully healed either, not yet. Something still lingered, a shadow he couldn't quite shake. He knew what it was: the guilt. The retreat had taught him how to cope. The mindfulness exercises helped him navigate his triggers, and the support from his allies had been unwavering. Yet deep down, he hadn't forgiven himself for the family he couldn't save. That fire still lived within him, not as a flame but as an ember, smoldering and refusing to go out. Cal noticed it, too. One evening after a session, he pulled Ethan aside. "You've come so far," Cal said, his voice steady yet gentle. "But you're still carrying that weight. It's time to confront it head-on." The words haunted Ethan for days. How do you confront a ghost? He tried journaling, meditating, even long drives with the windows down, but the guilt clung to him like smoke. It wasn't until Mia suggested volunteering with survivors of house fires that he saw a way forward. "Maybe you can give back what you feel you lost," she said. So Ethan began preparing, not with tools or gear, but with vulnerability and purpose. He reached out to a local support group for families who had endured fire-related trauma. They welcomed him cautiously at first, unsure of what a firefighter could offer. But Ethan spoke from the heart, sharing his own struggles and listening to theirs. Slowly, he became a bridge between their pain and hope. At the same time, Ethan doubled down on his self-care practices. He joined a yoga class to strengthen his body and clear his mind. He started running again, not to escape his thoughts but to embrace them. And each morning, he'd repeat a simple mantra: I am not defined by my failures. The biggest challenge came when he was asked to speak at a community event honoring first responders and survivors. The thought of standing in front of a crowd, bearing his soul, felt impossible. Ethan wanted to say no. Every fiber of his being screamed to stay in the safety of his routines. But something deeper urged him to accept, the part of him that remembered why he became a firefighter in the first place. Ethan spent weeks crafting his speech, pouring his journey onto the page. He practiced in front of Mia and even recorded himself to perfect the delivery. Each word felt like a step closer to the fire he had been running from. As the event approached, Ethan felt the weight of his final confrontation looming. The crowd wasn't his enemy, his own mind was. Yet, for the first time, he felt ready. Not entirely fearless, but ready to face the blaze within and come out on the other side. The day of the community event arrived, and Ethan woke with a knot in his stomach. The weight of his speech, his past, and his inner demons all pressed heavily on him. As he got ready, the mirror reflected not just a man, but the sum of every fire he had faced, literal and figurative. The auditorium was packed, buzzing with murmurs of anticipation. Survivors, families, firefighters, and local officials filled the seats, their eyes occasionally flickering toward the stage. Ethan waited backstage, his hands trembling despite the grounding exercises he'd practiced. Mia sat beside him, offering quiet encouragement. "You've got this," she whispered, her voice an anchor. But in Ethan's heart, doubt raged like an untamed inferno. When his name was called, Ethan stepped onto the stage, his legs feeling like lead. The lights were blinding, the faces a blur. The speech he had rehearsed so many times suddenly felt like a distant memory. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Panic clawed at him, threatening to consume everything he had built. And then, like a whisper through the chaos, he heard Cal's words from long ago breathe. "Anchor yourself. Trust your story." Ethan closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He wasn't here to be perfect. He was here to be real. He began to speak, his voice shaky but honest. He told the crowd about his first fire, the family he couldn't save, and the guilt that had almost destroyed him. He shared the sleepless nights, the therapy, and the small victories that felt monumental. As he spoke, the room grew silent, the audience hanging on his every word. But then, the crisis deepened. In the middle of his speech, a woman in the crowd burst into tears, her sobs echoing through the room. Ethan froze, unsure of what to do. The guilt returned, roaring to life. Was he reopening old wounds? Was he doing more harm than good? For a moment, Ethan felt like running, like retreating into the shadows where his pain couldn't touch anyone else. But as he looked at the woman, he saw something familiar. Not just grief, but a yearning for connection, for understanding. Ethan put down the microphone and stepped off the stage. He approached the woman slowly, kneeling beside her. "I'm sorry if my story hurt you," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "But I want you to know you're not alone. None of us are." The woman looked at him through tear-streaked eyes and nodded. Others in the crowd began to clap, then stand, their applause filling the room. It wasn't the polished speech Ethan had envisioned, but it was something more raw, real, and profoundly human. In that moment, Ethan realized that his crisis wasn't about failing or succeeding. It was about showing up, scars and all. And as he stood to face the crowd once more, he felt something shift within him. The embers of guilt were still there, but now they glowed with purpose, not pain. As the applause faded, Ethan stood in a room transformed, not by the grandeur of his words, but by the raw power of shared vulnerability. The air felt lighter, charged with a collective sense of healing and understanding. For the first time in years, he looked out at the faces before him and felt something he hadn't dared to embrace: peace. After the event, people lined up to speak with him. Survivors shared their own stories of battling despair. Parents thanked him for his honesty, and colleagues from the firehouse clapped him on the back with pride. The woman who had cried during his speech approached him last. "You gave me something I thought I'd lost," she said softly. "Hope." It wasn't just her words. It was the way she said them, her voice steady yet trembling with gratitude. Ethan felt the weight of her sincerity settle into his heart like a balm. This was the reward he hadn't expected. The realization that his pain, his journey, had the power to illuminate someone else's path. In the weeks that followed, Ethan noticed changes in himself. The nightmares didn't vanish, but they loosened their grip. He started running again, not to escape, but to feel alive. The journal he once hesitated to open became a refuge, its pages filled with reflections and small victories. Even at the firehouse, he felt a shift. He wasn't just a reliable firefighter anymore. He was a mentor, a source of quiet strength for rookies struggling with their own doubts. One evening, a young firefighter pulled him aside. "I've been where you were," the rookie admitted, his voice barely audible. "Hearing you speak, it made me realize I don't have to face it alone." Ethan nodded, his chest tight with emotion. "None of us do," he replied. The words felt like a gift, one he had worked hard to earn and now freely shared. And then one crisp autumn morning, he received an email. It was from the local mental health organization that had hosted the event. They wanted him to become an advocate, to speak at more events and help design programs for first responders. The idea both thrilled and terrified him, but he knew deep down that this was the next step. Accepting the offer wasn't just about helping others. It was about honoring his own journey. It was about proving to himself that his scars weren't signs of weakness, but testaments to his resilience. Ethan had found his treasure, though it wasn't gold or glory. It was connection. It was purpose. It was a quiet, unshakable belief that even in the darkest of nights, there is always the promise of dawn. Ethan stepped into his apartment, now bathed in the golden light of sunset. The place had changed subtly, no longer just a space for survival, but a sanctuary where growth thrived. On the wall hung a framed photo of his firehouse crew, their camaraderie frozen in time, a testament to battles fought together. Beside it was a small plaque awarded by the mental health organization. It wasn't the plaque itself that mattered, but what it represented: his journey from despair to hope. He sat by the window, sipping tea, something his mentor had once suggested as a calming ritual. Outside, children played on the street, their laughter a comforting background melody. For the first time in years, Ethan felt like he was part of that world, a world brimming with life, not just shadows. The journal on his coffee table was open to a page he'd written the night before. In it, he reflected on how far he'd come. It wasn't just about beating depression or overcoming the darkness. It was about reclaiming himself. He'd learned the importance of small victories. Mornings where getting out of bed felt like climbing Everest. Days where he chose connection over isolation. Nights when he allowed himself to dream again. His work as an advocate had taken on a rhythm of its own. Each speaking engagement brought new faces, new stories, new courage. He found joy in empowering others to face their battles, offering them practical tools, mental health strategies, natural depression remedies, and tips for beating depression. These weren't just words. They were lifelines, forged in his own crucible of struggle. One evening, during a workshop, a young woman had asked him, "How do you fight depression when it feels endless?" Ethan's response had surprised even himself. "You don't fight it alone. You let others in, you seek help, and you take it one moment at a time. It's not about erasing the pain, but learning to live beyond it." That wisdom had been hard-earned, and sharing it felt like releasing a burden he'd carried too long. Now, when he looked at the mirror, he saw not just a firefighter, but a man who had fought his inner flames and emerged tempered. The nights were still quiet, but they were no longer lonely. Ethan had started reaching out to old friends, rebuilding bridges he once thought had burned. He joined a hiking group, rediscovering the solace of nature. And though the ache of loss would always linger, it no longer defined him. With every passing day, the Ethan of the past felt more like a story he'd lived and less like the man he was becoming. He'd made peace with his pain, understanding it as a part of his tapestry, a thread woven alongside resilience, courage, and love. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan smiled. His journey wasn't over. It never would be. But he had found his footing on the path, and with every step forward, he carried the hope that his story might light the way for someone else. Ethan stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the building that had been his home for years. The familiar red door, the narrow stairs leading up to his small, cozy apartment. Everything felt different now. There was a sense of purpose in his steps, a weightlessness in his heart that wasn't there before. The journey was over, but the transformation was just beginning. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, taking in the familiar scent of old memories, coffee brewing in the morning, the faint aroma of spices from the kitchen. But today, it wasn't just a place of solitude. It was a space filled with the echoes of his journey, a testament to all he'd overcome. He hung his firefighter's jacket in its usual place, a quiet reminder of the battles he still fought and won. Ethan wandered over to his desk, where a notebook lay open. It was filled with notes, reminders, and thoughts from his healing journey. He picked it up and flipped through the pages, pausing at one that detailed a particularly tough day. The words were like scars on the paper, evidence of pain that had been transformed into strength. He smiled, realizing that those dark moments were not the end. They were the beginning of a new chapter. His phone buzzed, and he saw a message from his mentor. "Welcome back, Ethan. Your journey has been long and hard, but you've made it. The world is waiting for the man you've become." Ethan's eyes misted over, feeling a swell of gratitude. This was a man who had seen him at his lowest, believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. And now, he was finally ready to step into the light. Ethan spent the next few weeks reconnecting with old friends, rebuilding relationships that had frayed under the weight of his depression. There were lunches with colleagues, phone calls with family, and visits to the firehouse. Each interaction was a reminder of how far he'd come and how much he had to give. His voice was different now, stronger, more assured. He spoke with passion about his experiences, sharing not just his story but the lessons he'd learned. The day came when he was invited back to his old firehouse for a community event. As he walked through the doors, the familiar faces greeted him with smiles and applause. The crew gave him a standing ovation, and Ethan felt a rush of emotions. He had found his place again, not as a man defeated by his demons, but as a survivor, a leader, and a beacon of hope. He gave a speech that resonated with everyone in the room, speaking from the heart about his journey from darkness to light. Ethan knew that his work was not done. He was ready to use his story to help others, to show them that even in their darkest moments, there was a way out. He joined support groups, volunteered his time at mental health clinics, and began writing a book about his experiences. His story wasn't just his. It was a gift he was giving to the world, a roadmap for those who felt lost and alone. As he sat on his balcony, looking out at the city that had once seemed so overwhelming, Ethan knew that his journey had brought him full circle. He was back in the place where it all began, but now it was different. The city was no longer just a backdrop. It was his home, his community, and his family. And Ethan, the firefighter, was ready to face whatever the future held. Ethan's life had shifted in ways he never imagined. The darkness that once clouded his mind had lifted, not because the world had changed, but because he had. He no longer saw the familiar streets as a maze of uncertainty. They had become a canvas for his new purpose. With every step, he carried a newfound awareness, a deep knowing that the battle with depression was one that never truly ends. But now, instead of fighting to survive, he was fighting to live, and he was winning. Every morning, he woke with a sense of gratitude that had been foreign to him just a year ago. The smell of coffee, the sunlight pouring through his window, the feel of his boots hitting the pavement as he walked to work. Each moment felt like a small victory. His job at the firehouse had taken on new meaning. It wasn't just about putting out fires anymore. It was about saving lives in ways he hadn't understood before. He was more present with his team, more connected with the people he served. He had found purpose in the very things that had once made him feel so small. Ethan had discovered the power of sharing his journey, of opening up about the struggles he'd faced. His story, once one of isolation, had become a story of hope. He began volunteering at mental health clinics, speaking to others who were walking the same path he had. He could see the flickers of hope in their eyes when he spoke, the recognition that if he could make it out of the darkness, so could they. In the quiet moments, Ethan reflected on how far he had come. He had rebuilt relationships, mended old wounds, and reconnected with family members who had once watched from the sidelines, unsure of how to help. His relationship with his parents had healed, the distance between them closing with every honest conversation. His friends, too, had seen the change. They no longer looked at him with pity or concern, but with pride. The distance he had created when he was lost in depression had vanished, replaced with an open door to the love and support that had always been there. But perhaps the most significant change was within himself. Ethan had learned the art of self-compassion. He no longer saw himself as a failure or a victim, but as someone who had fought through hell and come out the other side stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. He began to see his own worth, not in what he could accomplish, but in who he had become. And that understanding of his own value became the cornerstone of his new life. Ethan knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would still be days when the weight of the world felt too heavy. But now, he had the tools, the knowledge, and the support to carry on. He had rebuilt his life, and with each passing day, he was reminded that the life he had now was the one he had earned, through resilience, courage, and an unshakable belief that he was worthy of happiness. And in that, he had found the greatest gift of all, peace. Ethan returned to the rhythms of everyday life, but everything felt different now. The world around him hadn't changed, but his perspective had. The once overwhelming noise of the city, its traffic, its people, now felt like music to his ears. There was no rush, no sense of urgency. His life had slowed down, but not in a way that made him feel trapped. No, it was as if he had been given the gift of presence, a gift he had been searching for his whole life. The firehouse was still the same. The smell of burnt wood and lingering smoke, the echo of boots against the floor, the distant sound of alarms. It all felt familiar, grounding. But it was different for Ethan now. He wasn't just there to fight fires anymore. He was there to listen, to lead, to be a steady presence for those who needed him most. He had learned to recognize the weight that others carried, and he carried it with them, not as a burden, but as a shared responsibility. His relationships, too, had transformed. The love he once thought he had lost was now stronger than ever. He had reconnected with his family in ways that felt almost miraculous. Each conversation an invitation to rebuild something they thought was lost. His friends, once distant and unsure of how to help, now looked to him for guidance. They admired the strength they saw in him, the quiet resilience that came from knowing how to fight, not just the flames, but the shadows within himself. And then there was a life he had always dreamed of, the one filled with balance, purpose, and fulfillment. Ethan had found peace in the simplest things. A cup of coffee on a lazy morning, a walk in the park, the joy of a shared laugh with his colleagues. These moments, once mundane, were now sacred. He understood now that the extraordinary lay not in grand achievements, but in the small, daily acts of living fully. The weight of depression no longer defined him. It had been a chapter in his story, yes, but it was no longer the plot. It was merely a lesson, a reminder of what he had overcome, of the man he had become. And as Ethan looked out over the city from the firehouse roof, he knew that the world was his to navigate, not with fear, but with an open heart and a clear mind. The shadows still came, but they no longer had the power to consume him. He had learned how to fight depression, not just in the darkest of times, but in every waking moment of his life. He was no longer just surviving. He was living. And in that, Ethan found his true victory.